officers were paid better, but by and large, the British sailors, especially after 1790, 1800, they had less incentive to do anything other than head for the nearest bar. So the Americans had very good relationships, especially with the trading Hans. Later in the 1810s and 20s, the leader of the Han was a Chinese merchant named Hu Hua. You can still buy some very expensive tea, which is known as Hu Hua tea, which is the finest Lapsang Su Chang tea. And interestingly enough, the Brits then started to put pressure on the Americans because they figured the best thing, rather than carrying manufactured goods or things, or even guns or weapons from England, the easiest thing that they could do was to get opium manufactured in India and sell it. And of course, the emperor, Chinese emperor, noticed what was happening and outlawed the opium trade. So the next thing that the Bay Company wanted to do was to get the Americans to smuggle in the boat. And I know that Black Ben Forbes was one of those. So Perkins and Company split up in 1826, which was relative, I mean, that's not very long in there. But they just split $30 million gold in 1826 among the sailors, the merchants, and other people. So you realize that the trade had been pretty good. I mean, $30 million in gold in 1820 is a hell of a lot of money. And but it did make a difference. A lot of them dropped out. John Murray Forbes actually had married a Quaker from a whaling family in New Bedford, and I'm sure that his Quaker wife made sure that he didn't get tangled up with trading in liquor or opium. But and it meant a number of these companies dropped out. Interestingly enough, Hu Hua, whose portrait hangs in the Museum of the American China Trade in Quincy, Massachusetts, used John Murray as his agent for investments in the United States. So, in other words, there was international finance even in those days, and that's really, considering the difference of the two countries is really great. So the relationship continued even though the direct trade, American trade, died out. And then, of course, you have the altercation developed into the Opium Wars in 1840 with the British. So that was one of the things that really changed things. Now, Baranov had managed the Russian-American company so well that they reestablished in Sitka with some British help, and they made arrangements with the Tlingit rather than fighting a pointless war that decimated both sides. They did come to trading agreements. There were 13 governors general after Baranov. Baranov actually had adopted native children. He also, yike. He was, there were two other temporary governors appointed after Baranov, but he didn't, he they'd never reached there to replace him. Anyway, the other and then, as I mentioned earlier, the Russian-American company in 1825 was in, the board of directors was involved with the attempt to institute a constitutional monarchy, and the plotting had taken place at their headquarters. So the Tsar essentially took over the Russian-American company and made sure that the all of the commanding officers and so on were Russian Navy officers of high rank. And one of them was Baron Ferdinand Wrangel, who was the governor from 1830 to 35. And the British had been elbowing in on the Stikine. So he established a fort at Fort Wrangel on the Stikine River, and actually placed a Tlinkits military group in charge of it. In other words, turning that over. There's a picture, which I do not have, of the Tlingit commander in a Russian uniform in charge, and he also gave them cannon and told them how to fire them for the Brits. So the Brits, being somewhat embarrassed, withdrew, and Wrangel negotiated a treaty for the lease of the area to the Brits and allowing them to navigate the Stikine River in exchange for food and other supplies, because potatoes apparently didn't grow too well in Kodiak and other places, so the supply of just food and essentials was rather limited, and the Russians never did quite anyway. There had been, of course, the building of Fort Ross, which in California, in Spanish territory, and that had been initiated by Rezanov, who was able to bring that around. And you had the neutrality pact between the Bay Company and the Russian-American company. Interesting enough, you know, you had the Crimean War break out in 1854, but you had the two corporations get together and agree that they would not allow any hostilities by their respective navies and to interfere with business. I mean, business was much more important than the silly little war, and that was quite interesting way of how it could. Now, toward the so actually in Wrangel's period, they built what's called Baronov's Castle in Sitka, and this was always the headquarters of the Governor General in the Russian period in Sitka. It burned after the takeover, so it's not, but this is now a park. But these actually are places where cannons were put, so it was not only a but it was a fort that would take oversee the area. Now, I'm skipping ahead because I'm falling behind. I talk too slowly or just trying to cover too much or whatever. Wrangel also did a lot